The smallest acts of kindness often reach the hearts that power could never touch. Ethan Romano had spent years learning that silence was the only place where no one expected anything from him. Every meeting demanded decisions. Every phone call carried another problem. Every handshake came with hidden expectations. So whenever the weight of his world became too heavy, he escaped to the oldest oak tree standing at the edge of the Romano estate, a towering giant whose branches stretched nearly 60 feet across the perfectly manicured gardens overlooking the quiet lake beyond. It was the only place where the wind sounded more honest than people. That warm Saturday afternoon, the estate shimmered beneath gentle September sunshine. The marble fountains whispered softly. Gardeners trimmed bright rose bushes in the distance. Birds drifted lazily from branch to branch, while a cool breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass across the sprawling grounds. From the outside, the Romano mansion looked like a place where nothing imperfect could ever exist. But Ethan knew better than anyone that beautiful places often hid exhausted souls. He loosened the top button of his white dress shirt, removed his expensive jacket, folded it carefully over a nearby stone bench, and slowly lowered himself beneath the enormous oak tree. Looking upward through the dancing leaves, he released a long breath that seemed to carry months of sleepless nights with it. Then he closed his eyes. He was not actually asleep. He simply wanted 30 uninterrupted minutes without someone asking him another question, another favor, another impossible solution. The staff had learned long ago that when Mr. Romano rested beneath the old tree, nobody disturbed him. Even security guards quietly redirected visitors to another part of the garden. It had become an unspoken rule throughout the estate. Ethan listened as the breeze rustled overhead. Somewhere nearby, water splashed gently inside the stone fountain. A squirrel darted across the grass before disappearing into the flower beds. For the first time in days, his breathing slowed. The silence felt almost peaceful. Then he heard something completely unexpected. Tiny footsteps. Soft, uneven, slow enough to belong to someone very small. Ethan resisted opening his eyes. Perhaps one of the gardeners had brought a child to work for a few minutes. Perhaps someone would notice and gently lead the little visitor away before reaching him. But the footsteps continued. Closer, then stopped only a few feet from where he rested beneath the tree. Through his closed eyelids, he sensed a small shadow blocking the afternoon sunlight. Still he remained perfectly still, curious now instead of annoyed. A tiny voice whispered so quietly that it almost blended into the wind. He is sleeping. There was a long pause. Ethan heard the faint rustle of fabric and the sound of something soft being dragged across the grass. Whatever the child was doing, every movement was slow and incredibly careful, as though trying not to wake someone after a long, tiring day. Another whisper followed. He looks cold. Ethan almost smiled. The afternoon temperature hovered near 74 degrees, warm enough that nobody could possibly be cold beneath the September sun. Yet the child's concern sounded completely sincere. A few more seconds passed. Then he felt something unbelievably gentle settle across his shoulders. It was small, light, slightly uneven. A toddler's tiny blanket, carefully stretched as far as little hands could manage. Ethan remained motionless, suddenly aware that his heartbeat had changed. Before he could gather his thoughts, another tiny sound reached him. The unmistakable crinkle of a snack wrapper. A small object was placed carefully beside his folded hand. The child whispered one final sentence with complete innocence. "You can have mine." For reasons Ethan could not explain, those 4 simple words reached somewhere deep inside him that years of success, wealth, and respect had never been able to touch. Still pretending to sleep, he realized that whatever happened next would become a moment he would remember for the rest of his life. Without opening his eyes, Ethan allowed the tiny blanket to remain across his shoulders. It barely covered his chest, and one corner slipped onto the grass almost immediately, yet he made no effort to adjust it. Somehow, removing it felt as though he would be rejecting something far greater than a piece of faded blue fabric. The little cookie resting beside his hand carried the unmistakable scent of vanilla, still sealed inside its colorful wrapper. It was the kind of inexpensive snack found in neighborhood grocery stores, nothing anyone would notice under ordinary circumstances. Yet at that moment, it felt more valuable than every expensive gift Ethan had received during the past decade. Tiny footsteps circled around him once before stopping again. The little voice whispered, almost proudly, "Now he has a blanket and food." Ethan heard a small, satisfied giggle. Then the footsteps wandered away through the soft grass. Only after another full minute passed did Ethan slowly open one eye. About 20 feet away, a toddler no older than 2 years old was carefully making his way toward a flower bed, his tiny sneakers wobbling slightly with every determined step. His curly dark hair bounced beneath the afternoon sunlight, and one small hand still clutched an empty snack wrapper, while the other reached curiously toward colorful butterflies dancing above the roses. There was nothing unusual about the child except the extraordinary kindness he had shown without expecting praise, reward, or even acknowledgement. Ethan quietly sat upright, still holding the tiny blanket across his lap. His eyes remained fixed on the little boy. The child never looked back to see whether his gift had been appreciated. He had already moved on to discovering the next wonderful thing the garden offered. Ethan could not remember the last time he had witnessed generosity so completely free of expectation. Every donation gala, every charity dinner, every public act of generosity he attended seemed to involve cameras, speeches, or recognition. This little boy had simply believed another person looked tired. That had been enough. As Ethan continued watching, a woman's anxious voice suddenly echoed across the gardens. "Caleb." The call carried unmistakable concern. A young woman wearing a simple housekeeping uniform hurried along the stone pathway, her eyes searching every corner of the estate. Grace Johnson had only worked at the Romano mansion for 3 months, but everyone knew her for arriving early, working quietly, and never complaining. Normally, her son spent weekdays at a neighborhood childcare center while she worked. But earlier that morning the center had unexpectedly closed because of a plumbing emergency, leaving Grace with no other option after every relative she called was unavailable. Mrs. Eleanor Brooks, the head housekeeper, had reluctantly allowed Caleb to remain in the employee lounge with coloring books and toys until Grace completed her afternoon assignments. Somehow, the curious little explorer had slipped away during only a few distracted minutes. Grace spotted Caleb near the flower beds and hurried toward him with visible relief mixed with embarrassment. "There you are, sweetheart." She gently lifted him into her arms before noticing the familiar figure beneath the oak tree. Her smile disappeared instantly. Her eyes moved from Ethan to the tiny blue blanket resting across his shoulders, and finally to the missing cookie from Caleb's snack bag. Confusion slowly spread across her face as the pieces came together. Ethan remained seated, saying nothing. Grace's expression turned pale. She immediately realized her son had approached the one person every employee had been instructed never to disturb while he rested beneath the old oak tree. Her heart sank as she quietly whispered, almost to herself, "Oh no." She had come searching for a curious toddler. Instead, she feared she had just discovered the moment that might cost her the best job she had ever had. Grace's pulse raced as she hurried toward Ethan with Caleb still resting against her shoulder. Every lesson she had learned during her first 3 months at the Romano estate echoed through her mind. Respect boundaries. Never interrupt the boss while he is alone. Keep personal matters separate from work. She had followed every rule with quiet determination because this job meant everything to her. It paid enough to keep a roof over their small apartment, covered Caleb's daycare tuition, and allowed her to send a little money each month to her grandmother who had raised her. Losing it was simply not an option. Reaching the old oak tree, Grace gently lowered Caleb onto the grass before speaking, her voice trembling with sincere embarrassment. "Mr. Romano, I am so sorry. I only looked away for a minute. He was supposed to stay in the employee lounge. I never would have allowed him to bother you on purpose." Ethan slowly stood, the tiny blue blanket still resting loosely across one arm, while the unopened cookie remained safely in his other hand. He looked from Grace to Caleb, who smiled proudly, completely unaware that anything unusual had happened. The little boy pointed excitedly toward Ethan and announced, he was sleepy. Grace closed her eyes for a brief second, wishing she could disappear beneath the perfectly trimmed lawn. "Caleb," she whispered gently, "we do not interrupt people when they are resting." The toddler looked confused. His small eyebrows lifted as he glanced between his mother and Ethan. "But when mommy is tired, I give her my blanket." The simple explanation settled into the quiet afternoon air like a feather drifting to the ground. Grace felt tears threaten the corners of her eyes. not because of fear anymore, but because she suddenly understood exactly what had happened. Caleb had not wandered into the garden searching for trouble. He had simply seen another adult who looked as exhausted as his mother often did after long workdays. In his innocent little world, tired people deserved blankets and snacks. Ethan remained silent for several seconds, studying the child with an expression Grace could not read. She expected disappointment. She prepared herself for polite dismissal. Instead, Ethan slowly knelt until he was almost at Caleb's eye level. "Did you give me your favorite cookie?" he asked softly. Caleb nodded with complete seriousness. "Yes, it is yummy." Ethan looked at the unopened wrapper in his hand before asking another question. "Then what were you going to eat?" Caleb shrugged as though the answer were obvious. "Mommy says we share." Ethan lowered his eyes for a moment. Somewhere deep inside his memory, another afternoon surfaced. He was barely older than Caleb, sitting at a tiny kitchen table, while his own mother quietly slid the larger piece of cornbread onto his plate, insisting she was not hungry, even though he later realized she had skipped dinner so he could eat more. He had not thought about that memory in years. Not because he wanted to forget it, but because life had become too busy to remember the things that once mattered most. Grace noticed the change in Ethan's face. The stern expression that often appeared during business meetings had disappeared completely. In its place rested something softer, almost nostalgic. Caleb reached out with one tiny hand and gently patted Ethan's sleeve. "You feel better now?" Ethan looked directly into the little boy's bright brown eyes and answered with quiet honesty, "I think I do." Grace stared in complete disbelief. The conversation unfolding before her was unlike anything she had imagined. The most respected man in the estate was not upset that a toddler had interrupted his afternoon. Instead, he seemed genuinely grateful. And for reasons she could not yet understand, Grace suddenly sensed that Caleb's tiny act of kindness had changed something far greater than one peaceful afternoon beneath an old oak tree. Grace could hardly believe what she had just witnessed. She had expected a polite warning, perhaps even a formal conversation with Mrs. Eleanor Brooks about bringing Caleb to work. Instead, Ethan carefully folded the tiny blue blanket with both hands, treating it with the same respect he normally reserved for expensive tailored clothing. He handed it back to Caleb with a gentle smile. "I think this belongs to you," he said quietly. Caleb accepted it happily, but immediately pushed it back toward Ethan again. "You keep it until you are not tired anymore." Ethan paused, caught completely off guard by the innocent logic only a small child could possess. Grace knelt beside her son and softly brushed a curl away from his forehead. "Sweetheart, Mr. Romano has his own blankets at home." Caleb looked around the enormous estate with genuine curiosity before asking, "Even big houses need blankets?" Ethan let out the smallest laugh, one so unexpected that even he seemed surprised by the sound. "Yes," he answered. "Sometimes they do." The laughter faded into another comfortable silence as birds continued singing above the ancient oak tree. For the first time in months, Ethan noticed details he had overlooked every afternoon. The sunlight filtering through thousands of green leaves. The gentle movement of dragonflies above the pond. The peaceful rhythm of ordinary life continuing without schedules, meetings, or deadlines. Caleb had unknowingly pulled him completely into the present moment. Grace finally gathered enough courage to speak honestly. "Mr. Romano, I appreciate your kindness today, but I promise this will never happen again. The daycare center called this morning about a broken water pipe, and I had no one else who could watch him. Mrs. Brooks allowed him to stay in the employee lounge just until I finished cleaning the guest suites." Ethan nodded thoughtfully. "You have been worried all day." Grace hesitated before quietly admitting the truth. Every minute. Ethan understood that feeling better than she realized. He had spent years worrying about responsibilities no one else could see. Looking at Grace, he recognized another kind of burden. The quiet pressure of trying to be both a dependable employee and a devoted mother at exactly the same time. Neither role allowed mistakes. Neither offered much rest. Caleb suddenly tugged gently on Ethan's sleeve. "Do you have a mommy?" The unexpected question filled the garden with another long silence. Grace immediately apologized. "Caleb, that is a very personal question." Ethan slowly shook his head. "It is all right." He looked toward the distant lake where sunlight shimmered across the calm water. "I did." His voice remained steady, but something inside those two simple words carried years of quiet longing. Caleb thought carefully before climbing down from his mother's lap. He walked the short distance toward Ethan and stretched both tiny arms upward. Without hesitation, Ethan knelt again. Caleb wrapped his little arms around Ethan's neck in a brief, innocent hug before whispering, "She would want you to smile." Grace covered her mouth in complete surprise. Ethan closed his eyes for only a second, overwhelmed by emotions he had buried beneath endless work and responsibility. When Caleb stepped back, Ethan quietly reached into the pocket of his jacket resting on the nearby stone bench. Instead of offering money or an expensive gift, he removed a simple silver pocket notebook and wrote down a single sentence before tearing out the page. Folding it carefully, he slipped it into his wallet behind an old family photograph. Grace noticed only the first few words before the paper disappeared. "Never forget today." She did not understand why one afternoon beneath an old oak tree had become important enough for the most respected man she had ever met to preserve forever, but she sensed that the little boy standing beside her had awakened a memory that Ethan Romano had almost lost, and neither of them yet realized how far that quiet moment would reach into all of their futures. That evening, long after the gardens had emptied and the estate settled into its familiar rhythm, Ethan sat alone inside his private study with every light turned off except the small brass desk lamp beside him. The unopened vanilla cookie rested carefully on the polished mahogany surface, still inside its colorful wrapper exactly as Caleb had placed it beneath the old oak tree. Around it lay business contracts worth millions of dollars, financial reports awaiting signatures, and invitations to exclusive charity events. Yet Ethan found himself looking only at the little cookie. It was astonishing how something so ordinary could outweigh everything else in the room. He leaned back in his leather chair and slowly opened the worn leather wallet he had carried for nearly 20 years. Behind family photographs rested the folded note he had written only hours earlier. "Never forget today." He read the words once more before closing his eyes. Almost immediately, another memory returned with startling clarity. He was 5 years old again, sitting on the front steps of a tiny brick apartment building while autumn leaves rolled across the sidewalk. His mother had worked double shifts cleaning office buildings downtown, often returning home long after sunset with tired feet and aching hands. One afternoon she arrived carrying only a small paper bag from a neighborhood bakery. Inside rested a single cinnamon roll. Ethan remembered trying to split it in half because he knew she had not eaten lunch. She smiled, gently pushed the larger piece back toward him, and said the same words Caleb had unknowingly echoed decades later. "You eat first." Sharing means giving someone what they need before thinking about yourself. At the time, he believed she simply wanted him to grow strong. Years later, he discovered she had quietly skipped meals more often than he ever realized. Somewhere between building a successful life and carrying endless responsibilities, he had buried that memory beneath schedules, meetings, and accomplishments. Caleb had uncovered it without even trying. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Vincent Marino stepped carefully into the office carrying the final reports from the day. He paused immediately after noticing the untouched paperwork and the tiny cookie sitting alone in the center of the desk. "Everything all right?" Vincent asked. Ethan smiled faintly without taking his eyes off the wrapper. "Better than all right." Vincent placed the folders down and followed Ethan's gaze. "Planning to eat that?" Ethan carefully picked up the cookie and turned it over in his hand, as though examining a priceless family heirloom. "No," he answered quietly. "I think I am planning to remember it." Vincent looked puzzled, but chose not to press further. After years of working beside Ethan, he had learned that some answers revealed themselves only when the time was right. Once Vincent left, Ethan rose from his chair and walked toward the wide windows overlooking the estate. The moon reflected gently across the lake beyond the gardens, and in the distance he could just make out the silhouette of the old oak tree standing peacefully against the night sky. For years he had believed success meant protecting people through strength, providing opportunities, and solving impossible problems. Those things still mattered. But now he realized something equally important. People also needed to feel seen. They needed to know their struggles mattered before anyone tried to solve them. Grace had carried the quiet weight of motherhood while working every shift without complaint. Caleb had noticed a tired stranger before anyone else had. Together, without intending to, they had reminded Ethan of a version of himself he feared had disappeared forever. He slipped the unopened cookie into the top drawer of his desk beside the folded note and gently closed it. It would remain there, untouched, not because it was valuable to anyone else, but because it represented the day an innocent act of generosity reopened a door inside his heart that years of achievement had quietly closed. And as Ethan looked once more toward the old oak tree beneath the moonlit sky, he realized that the greatest inheritance anyone could leave behind was never measured in wealth, but in the simple kindness that taught another person how to remember who they truly were. The weeks that followed brought changes so gradual that most people inside the Romano estate noticed them only after they had already become part of everyday life. Ethan still arrived before sunrise, but the endless stack of untouched breakfast trays outside his office quietly disappeared. Instead of skipping meals, he occasionally joined the kitchen staff for a simple cup of coffee before the first meetings began. He started walking through the gardens every afternoon, no longer to escape the world, but to remember that life continued beyond conference tables and financial reports. The old oak tree became more than a place of solitude. It became a quiet reminder that even the busiest hearts deserved moments of peace. Grace noticed the changes from a respectful distance. She continued cleaning guest rooms, arranging fresh flowers, and polishing the grand staircase exactly as she always had. She never mentioned the afternoon beneath the tree, believing it had simply become one meaningful memory among many in Ethan's extraordinary life. Caleb, however, remembered everything. Every time they passed through the garden, he pointed excitedly toward the great oak tree and smiled as though greeting an old friend. One crisp October morning, Mrs. Eleanor Brooks called Grace into her office. Grace immediately wondered whether she had accidentally overlooked another responsibility. Instead, Mrs. Brooks handed her a neatly folded letter bearing the Romano family crest. "Mr. Romano asked me to give this to you personally," she said with a gentle smile. Grace carefully unfolded the letter, expecting new work instructions. Instead, she found a handwritten message. It explained that beginning the following month, the estate would introduce a dedicated childcare room for employees facing temporary family emergencies. Flexible scheduling would also become available for parents whenever unexpected situations arose. At the bottom of the page, Ethan had added one personal sentence in his own handwriting. No parent should have to choose between protecting their child and keeping their livelihood. Grace lowered the paper slowly, unable to speak. Mrs. Brooks quietly admitted that the decision had surprised every department manager because Ethan had approved the entire program within a single afternoon, insisting it should never be presented as charity, but simply as respect for hardworking families. Grace thanked her softly before stepping outside into the autumn sunshine. She immediately found Caleb chasing colorful leaves across the lawn near the old oak tree. As she watched him laugh, tears filled her eyes, not from sadness but from relief. For the first time since becoming a mother, she felt that someone in a position of authority truly understood the invisible weight parents carried every day. Several months later, the estate hosted its annual employee appreciation gathering in the gardens. Families were invited for the first time. Children played safely beneath colorful decorations while parents enjoyed an afternoon without worrying about balancing work and family responsibilities. Caleb, now a little taller and even more energetic, spotted Ethan standing beneath the familiar oak tree speaking with guests. Without hesitation, he ran across the grass with joyful determination. Ethan noticed him immediately, knelt down, and smiled before Caleb wrapped both little arms around his neck in another spontaneous hug. "You are smiling now," Caleb said proudly. Ethan laughed warmly. "I am." Grace approached a moment later, apologizing out of habit, but Ethan gently shook his head. "Please do not apologize for kindness," he said. "This little man reminded me of something I should never have forgotten." His eyes lifted briefly toward the wide branches stretching overhead, where sunlight filtered gently through the autumn leaves just as it had on that unforgettable afternoon. The great oak tree had never changed. The gardens remained just as beautiful. The mansion still stood with all its elegance and quiet power. The difference was found inside the people who walked those paths every day. One innocent child had shared his blanket and his favorite cookie without expecting anything in return, and in doing so had awakened compassion inside a man the world admired for his strength. From that day forward, The Romano estate became known not only for its success or influence, but for the quiet humanity that lived within its walls, proving that sometimes the smallest hands carry the greatest reminders that dignity, kindness, and love are the richest legacy anyone can leave behind. As winter slowly gave way to the first gentle days of spring, the changes inside the Romano estate reached far beyond new policies and renovated rooms. They began appearing in the smallest conversations, the quietest gestures, and the ordinary routines that no one had questioned before. Housekeepers no longer rushed through their shifts afraid to ask for help when family emergencies arose. Supervisors started checking on employees before assigning extra work. Even the executive staff noticed that Ethan had developed an unexpected habit of walking through every department at least once each week, not to inspect mistakes, but simply to thank people whose names had once existed only on payroll reports. Many employees assumed these changes came from a new management strategy. Only Grace understood that they had begun beneath the old oak tree with a tiny blanket and a single unopened cookie. She never spoke about that afternoon. She believed some moments became more meaningful when protected by silence. Caleb, however, never kept joyful memories to himself. Every visit to the estate became another adventure in his growing imagination. He proudly introduced the old oak tree to anyone willing to listen, calling it the sleepy tree because it was where he had met the nicest grown-up he knew. One bright Saturday morning, Grace arrived earlier than usual because the childcare room had organized a small family breakfast for employees and their children. Laughter echoed through the renovated space where colorful books, wooden toys, and tiny tables now filled what had once been an unused storage room. Parents smiled with visible relief as their children played safely nearby while they prepared for work. Grace stood quietly near the doorway, watching Caleb build a tower from wooden blocks alongside other children. She realized this room represented far more than a workplace improvement. It represented dignity. Someone had looked beyond job titles and recognized that hardworking parents carried responsibilities no schedule could fully measure. As she watched the children laugh together, Ethan entered the room without ceremony, dressed in a simple charcoal sweater instead of his usual tailored suit. The conversations gradually softened as employees noticed his arrival. Rather than making a speech, he walked directly toward the children. Caleb immediately looked up, his face lighting with unmistakable excitement. "You came back," he exclaimed as though greeting an old friend. Ethan smiled warmly. "I promised myself I would." Caleb reached into the pocket of his little jacket and proudly pulled out a small wrapped cookie. Grace instinctively started to stop him, worried he might once again offer away his favorite snack. Before she could speak, Caleb held it out toward Ethan with complete confidence. "This one is for sharing. Mommy bought 2 today." Ethan accepted the cookie carefully, his smile growing brighter than anyone in the room had ever seen. "Then we should both have one," he replied. He opened the package, broke one cookie gently into 2 equal pieces, and handed half back to Caleb. The little boy laughed with delight, pleased that this time they could both enjoy the treat together. Grace watched the simple exchange with quiet emotion. Months earlier, her son had believed kindness meant giving everything away. Now he was learning an even deeper lesson. Real kindness also allowed others to give something back. Ethan understood that lesson as well. He had spent much of his life believing leadership meant carrying every burden alone. Caleb had shown him that true strength often began the moment people shared what they had, whether it was a cookie, a blanket, a burden, or simply a little hope. As warm spring sunlight streamed through the childcare room windows and filled the laughter of children with golden light, Ethan quietly realized that the greatest investment he had ever made was not found in buildings, businesses, or financial success, but in creating a place where ordinary acts of compassion could quietly become part of everyday life. Late that summer, an unexpected visitor arrived at the Romano estate, not as a business partner or public official, but as an elderly woman who had spent more than 30 years working as a housekeeper before retiring. She had been invited to speak during the annual Employee Appreciation Luncheon after several longtime staff members suggested honoring people whose quiet service often went unnoticed. Ethan listened from the front row while the elderly woman spoke with remarkable grace about the dignity of ordinary work. She described polished floors that no one remembered cleaning, meals prepared before sunrise, and countless small acts of care that allowed other families to thrive. Her words filled the elegant dining hall with thoughtful silence because everyone recognized the truth inside them. When the event ended, employees gathered around to thank her before gradually returning to their duties. Ethan remained seated for a moment, reflecting on everything he had heard. As he stepped outside into the warm afternoon air, he noticed Grace and Caleb walking slowly through the gardens toward the old oak tree. Caleb, now more confident and talkative than ever, carried a small paper bag in one hand. Ethan smiled as he joined them beneath the familiar branches. "What do you have today?" he asked. Caleb grinned proudly before opening the bag. Inside were 3 homemade oatmeal cookies. "Mommy and I made them," he said. "One for me, one for Mommy, one for you." Ethan accepted the cookie carefully, remembering the unopened vanilla cookie still resting safely inside the top drawer of his desk. This time he did not hesitate. He took a bite, smiling as Caleb watched eagerly for his reaction. "It is wonderful," Ethan said sincerely. Caleb clapped his hands with delight while Grace laughed softly, relieved to see such simple happiness shared so naturally. As they stood together beneath the shade of the old oak tree, Vincent Marino approached carrying a folder. He slowed when he noticed the scene before him. The powerful businessman he had known for years was no longer discussing contracts or financial projections. Instead, he was sitting comfortably on the grass beside a little boy, sharing homemade cookies beneath the same tree where everything had quietly begun months earlier. Vincent smiled to himself before closing the folder without interrupting. Whatever business matter he had intended to discuss could certainly wait. Some moments deserved protection rather than interruption. Ethan noticed Vincent in the distance and gave him a reassuring nod that silently said everything was under control. Vincent returned the gesture and quietly walked away. Grace looked toward Ethan with genuine gratitude. "You have changed many lives here," she said softly. Ethan slowly shook his head. "No," he replied. "People often believe change begins with the person holding the most authority. Sometimes it begins with the smallest person in the room." Caleb looked up curiously, unaware that they were speaking about him. He simply smiled because everyone around him seemed happy. Ethan watched the little boy chase butterflies across the grass while sunlight danced through the branches overhead. He realized that leadership had never truly been about standing above others. It had always been about creating space where kindness could grow without fear. Around them, employees crossed the gardens carrying flowers, tools, and baskets for another ordinary afternoon. Yet the estate no longer felt defined by wealth or prestige alone. It had become a place where people greeted one another by name, where parents no longer hid their struggles, and where compassion had quietly become part of the culture. Ethan reached into his pocket and gently unfolded the small handwritten note he had carried with him since that unforgettable day. "Never forget today." Looking toward Grace and Caleb beneath the broad canopy of the old oak tree, he smiled before carefully folding the note once more, realizing that he no longer needed it as a reminder because the lesson had become part of the person he had chosen to be. 1 year later, the Romano estate looked much the same to anyone driving past its towering gates. The gardens still bloomed with perfect rows of roses. The fountains still shimmered beneath the afternoon sun. The old oak tree still stretched its wide branches across the lawn, offering quiet shade to anyone who needed a moment away from the world. Yet the people who lived and worked there knew something had changed forever. New employees often wondered why the childcare center occupied one of the brightest wings of the estate or why family photographs decorated the staff lounge walls. They noticed supervisors greeting every employee by name, parents leaving work without fear when their children became sick, and managers who understood that compassion was not a weakness but a responsibility. When they asked how those traditions had begun, the longtime staff simply smiled and glanced toward the old oak tree without saying very much. Some stories became stronger every time they were quietly remembered instead of repeatedly explained. Grace still worked at the estate, though now she supervised several younger housekeepers who often came to her for advice. She always reminded them that excellence was measured not only by spotless rooms or polished floors, but by the way people cared for one another when nobody else was watching. Caleb had grown into a cheerful little boy whose curiosity never seemed to fade. Every afternoon after preschool, He hurried through the gardens with the same joyful energy he had carried since he first wandered beneath the ancient tree. Whenever Ethan returned from long meetings, Caleb raced toward him with stories about birds, butterflies, school projects, or whatever new discovery had captured his imagination that day. Ethan always listened with complete attention, no matter how busy his schedule had been only moments earlier. One crisp autumn afternoon, nearly exactly 1 year after the little blanket and the unopened cookie had quietly changed everything, Ethan walked alone toward the old oak tree, carrying a small wooden box. Grace and Caleb happened to notice him from the nearby garden path and slowly followed at a respectful distance. Ethan knelt beneath the broad branches and carefully opened the box. Inside rested the faded blue toddler blanket, folded with remarkable care, alongside the unopened vanilla cookie that had remained preserved inside its wrapper all that time. He smiled gently before placing both keepsakes inside a protective glass display case that had been built into a simple wooden bench beneath the tree. A small bronze plaque rested beside it. It did not mention wealth, titles, or achievements. It simply read, "The greatest gifts are given by hearts expecting nothing in return." Caleb looked up at his mother with wide eyes. "That is my blanket." Grace squeezed his little hand and quietly nodded. Ethan turned toward them with the same warm smile Caleb had first inspired one unforgettable afternoon. "It belongs to all of us now," he said softly. "It reminds us who we should always be." Visitors who later walked through the gardens often paused beside the bench, wondering why such ordinary objects had been displayed with so much care. Most never learned the full story. They only sensed that something meaningful had happened beneath those ancient branches. Grace watched Caleb run ahead laughing beneath the falling autumn leaves, and Ethan realized that the estate's greatest legacy would never appear on financial statements or newspaper headlines. It would live inside every child welcomed without judgment, every parent treated with dignity, every employee respected beyond a job title, and every quiet act of kindness that continued spreading from one ordinary heart to another. The old oak tree remained exactly where it had always stood, but because one innocent little boy believed a tired stranger deserved his favorite cookie and his tiny blanket, an entire community learned that genuine greatness is never proven by the power someone holds, but by the compassion they choose to share. And from that day forward, everyone who walked beneath those branches remembered what dignity, kindness, and humanity truly looked like.